Turn to Matthew 17, 1 through 20, where Jesus is transfigured on the mountain. Matthew 17, 1 through 20. Matthew 17, 1 through 20. Jesus transfigured on the mount. Now, after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John his brother, led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. And behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him. And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their faces and were greatly afraid. But Jesus came and touched them and said, Arise, and do not be afraid. And when they had lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. Now as they came down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, saying, Tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man is risen from the dead. And his disciples asked him, saying, Why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? Jesus answered and said to them, Indeed, Elijah is coming first and will restore all things. But I say to you that Elijah has already come, and they did not know him, but did to him whatever they wished. Likewise, the Son of Man is also about to suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he spoke to them of John the Baptist. And when they had come to the multitude, a man came to him, kneeling down to him, saying, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and suffers severely, for he often falls into the fire and often into the water. So I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't cure him. Then the disciples answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him here to me. And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the child was cured from that very hour. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, Why could we not cast it out? So Jesus said to them, Because of your unbelief. For assuredly I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, Move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. 2 stories. Jesus transfigured and a boy healed after the disciples who Jesus had empowered to go out and heal people and cast out demons were unable to. Questions. Have you ever tried to describe something to someone that you had witnessed and they didn't believe it? Maybe it was something ordinary, maybe it was something really big, and you tried to describe it to them and they didn't believe you. Wonder what happened when Peter, James, and John went down from the mountain. Why did Jesus only take these 3? Why didn't he take all of his disciples up there with him? And what's the meaning of this event? I think it's interesting. A lot of times in the Bible, things happen on a mountain. And likewise in our Christian experience, sometimes we're on the mountaintop. Sometimes things are bad. We're in the valley. We're having rough times. But on the mountaintop, something's always happened. Jesus was tempted on the mountain. Satan put him there, showed him all the kingdoms of the earth. Moses went up to get the 10 Commandments. Jesus goes up to the mountain here and is transfigured before his disciples. So Jesus took Peter, James, and John. He didn't invite them all, but only these 3. Maybe he didn't want this miracle told of before its time, although you know that these 3 are going to tell the others. Others have suggested he did it because these 3 disciples needed more supervision than the others. You got James and John, the sons of thunder. They were always saying the wrong thing. And Peter was brash, and often said the wrong thing. So maybe Jesus took them because they were the troublemakers. Okay, so he needed to keep an eye on them. Maybe not. That's speculation. Just like ornery kids who need constant watching. And so then he was transfigured before them. And the word transfigured means a transformation of his outward appearance. And the effect was striking. He became so bright in appearance that they couldn't look at him. It reminded me of the time when Moses in the Old Testament asked to see God, and God said, hide your face inside this crevice here and look away, and I'll cover you with my hand, and I'll let my glory pass by you. Because no one can see God in this human body. Nobody can see God and live. That's kind of what reminded me of here. When he was transfigured, they had to look away. For one thing, he was bright. For another reason, they were scared. Transfigure, transform. His form changed. It suggests a change of the inner nature that's outwardly visible. And it may be the glory that shined in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus was, remember when he was arrested and the soldiers came and he said, "Who do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he said, "I'm he." And when he did, they fell back. That glory, the glory of God, the same glory that the disciples witnessed on the mountain. And David Guzik says in his commentary that for Jesus, this wasn't a new miracle, but the temporary ceasing of an ongoing one. The real miracle was that Jesus, most of the time, could keep from displaying his glory to man. Yet John said in John 1:14, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." So his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. Jesus didn't transform into someone else. He transformed into a glorified Jesus before them. Jesus has his disciples with him when he shines in this glory. He did it to share with them. He wanted them to see it. In John 17:24, Jesus praying in the garden says, "Father, I desire that they also whom you gave me may be with me where I am, that they may behold my glory, which you have given me." That's when Jesus was praying before his arrest. Moses and Elijah appeared to him. Two Old Testament characters representing Moses, the law, and Elijah, the prophets, the law and the prophets. Jesus fulfilling both of those. Jesus, God in the flesh. Jesus, present at creation, was the giver of the law. He was the embodiment of the law, and he was also the central figure of all prophecy. I mean, there were prophecies that told what was going to happen to Israel, but the vast majority of the prophecies in the Bible talk about Jesus and what's going to happen and where he's going to be born, how he's going to be born, how he's going to die. The fulfillment. There they are. Moses had been dead some 1,400 years, and Elijah had been taken up to heaven some 900 years before that. And here they are. And the disciples, Peter, James, and John, recognized them. How? I don't know. They had little name tags on that said who they were. But they recognized them. They knew that it was Moses. They knew that it was Elijah. They recognized him. Knowledge given to them by God. And then in Luke, I probably should have used the story in Luke instead of Matthew because it goes into more detail. It says that Jesus talked with Elijah and Moses about what was going to come to pass, that he was going to be crucified, he was going to die for the sins of the world. In Luke 9:31, it says, they spoke of his decease, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. They talked about his upcoming work on the cross and the resurrection to follow. And Luke's account tells what they talked about. Let me read that. You don't have to turn there. It's in Luke 9. They go up to the mountain. As Jesus prayed, the appearance of his face was altered. His robe became white and glistening. Moses and Elijah came. Okay, and it's what I quoted earlier. Spoke of his decease, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Okay, so they talked about, here's the law, here's the prophets, here's the fulfillment, and they talked about what's going to happen. They talked about what Jesus was going to do. Is it possible they praised him? I think so. Is it possible they encouraged him? I think so. Is it possible they worshiped him? I think so. So then they start coming down from this mountaintop experience, and Peter says, well, maybe we should build 3 tabernacles here, one for you, one for Elijah, one for Moses. And Jesus says, well, then the cloud appears. Again, manifestation of God. We talked about last week, Shekinah glory, God manifesting himself physically in the physical world. Here's this cloud. A voice comes out of the cloud and says, this is my son, hear him. And Jesus goes, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do that. For one thing, Peter was dumbfounded. He spoke without thinking. And what he was doing, saying this, he was elevating Elijah and Moses to be equal with God, equal with Jesus. And we're not going to have that. Now, it's true that it could have been around the time or shortly after the Feast of Tabernacles where they built little shelters, is why Peter said this. We really don't know. I think it's because You've all been in a situation where you feel like you need to say something and you don't know what to say. And I think that was Peter. Let's build 3 tabernacles, one for all 3 of you guys. Jesus says, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. They were overwhelmed, to say the least. And we're like Peter sometimes. We feel the need to say something when sometimes the best response is silence or no answer at all. Okay. God spoke out of the cloud, hear my son. When this happened, they fell on their faces. They were afraid. They didn't fall on their faces, I don't think, earlier when Jesus was transfigured, when his face was shining. But now when they hear the voice of God speak from the cloud, that they fall down. They fall down in fear and in worship. And Guzik's commentary says, well, what happens next? Jesus says, don't be afraid. They go down the mountain. Now, David Guzik in his commentary, and this guy's really good, the way he connects things, talking about Jesus and Moses. What happened when Moses came down from the mountain after God had given him the 10 Commandments? What did he find? What was going on? The children of Israel were messing up. Moses had been gone for a while. They told Aaron, they took gold rings and stuff to him and earrings and said, here, make us an idol, make us a calf that we can worship. So when he came down, when Moses came down from the mountain, that's what he encountered. And then, of course, he threw down the tablets, which Bible historians say Moses was the only person to ever break all 10 commandments at one time. When he threw down the tablets. And, a lot of those people were killed. Jesus comes down from the mountain. Whenever you have or I have a mountaintop experience, that's good, but there's always going to be a coming down the mountain. And not coming around the mountain, coming down the mountain, okay? Jesus comes down the mountain, and he's immediately confronted by a man who says, it says his son was epileptic. He said, I brought him, Lord, can you heal him? I brought him to your disciples, and they couldn't heal him. And Jesus says something that's, to me, is very striking when he refers to the faithless generation. He said, oh, faithless generation, how long will I be with you? And so then Jesus rebuked the demon and cast it out. Jesus came down from the mountain and found that the disciples, possibly their lack of faith in healing this boy, was keeping them from healing this boy. And so Jesus rebuked the demon. It came out of him. The child was cured from that very hour. And then they said, why couldn't we do it? And Jesus said, because of your unbelief, for surely I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. How much? Consider this. I know what I think, but you have to decide what you believe. How much of our unbelief affects what God can do in our lives? That's something we should meditate on every day. How much of my unbelief affects what God can do in my life? How much of your unbelief affects what God can do in your life? One of my favorite passages, I just went dead. One of my favorite passages in the Bible is when the one guy comes to Jesus, come heal my son. And then while he's talking to Jesus, his servants come and say, don't bother Jesus, your kid's dead. First thing Jesus said, don't fear, only believe. And that's one of the greatest prayers in the Bible. God, help me not to fear, but just to believe. So Jesus heals him. Hopefully this was a learning time for the disciples. Peter, James, and John witnessing Jesus transfigured. I'm sure they told the disciples about it. The disciples seeing Jesus heal this boy and being somewhat reprimanded for their lack of faith. And Guzik in his commentary says the failure may have been good for them because it taught them to get out of the rut of the ordinary mechanical ministry, the vain repetition of ministry. It taught them the great superiority of Jesus. It taught them to ask and wish for the presence of Jesus. And it taught them to always come to Jesus with the problem. Okay? The guy was still there. When they couldn't heal him, they didn't send him away. I think they said, wait around. If you wait around here, Jesus will be back. That's what I think. Okay? That's not scriptural. So the transfiguration shows us who Jesus is and who he was. And like the disciples, we need to have it drilled into our heads that we can and must come to Jesus with our problems. It reminds me of that song. I love that song, I Must Tell Jesus. I must tell Jesus all of my trials. I cannot bear these burdens alone. In my distress, he kindly will help me. He ever loves and cares for his own. I must tell Jesus all of my trials. I cannot bear these burdens alone. I'm repeating. The chorus. I must tell Jesus, I must tell Jesus. I cannot bear my burdens alone. I must tell Jesus, I must tell Jesus. Jesus can help me. Jesus alone. You know, we need to get back to the point. I think one of the reasons this revival started down in Asbury is because people had been praying and a few people realized that they drifted away a little bit. They were still on the path, but they weren't as close to God as they used to be, and it wasn't God who moved. It was them who moved. Jesus was transfigured to prove to us, to show us who he was and who he is, and also to show us that glory of God that is manifested in us in our physical world. And I think he still can do that today. We're going to have a closing hymn. Encourage you to stand and sing and respond to the Lord however you need to this morning. So, Jan.